The Something You Should Know podcast today is sponsored by Audible.com. If you would like a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial to the Audible service, just go to audibletrial.com/SYSK. audibletrial.com/SYSK. Today on Something You Should Know, how to deal with those embarrassing, awkward moments we all have that make us want to crawl into a hole. Also, how money affects your mind. It's often so totally irrational.
In one experiment, they gave people a menu for a restaurant called Studio 19 and asked people how much they'd be prepared to pay for a meal there. And then they gave exactly the same menu to another group of people and told them it was called Studio 97. Suddenly, people were prepared to pay much more to eat at the restaurant with the higher number in its name.
And if you want to sock away money in a savings account and not touch it, put it in a bank that sounds far away, like the Bank of Scotland.
Because even though you can just get that money online, it feels as if it's further away. It means people are likely to leave it there for longer. So in a way, you can trick yourself.
And the power of appreciation. You'll have a whole new appreciation for appreciation when you hear this. All this today on Something You Should Know.
Something you should know. Fascinating intel, the world's top experts, and practical advice you can use in your life today.
The Something You Should Know podcast
with Mike Carruthers.
Hello, welcome to the podcast. I am Mike Carruthers, and I appreciate you listening. In fact, I read somewhere recently that there's something like a couple of 100,000 podcasts available. A couple of 100,000 podcasts. And you picked mine. So I appreciate that. We continue to rank high in the iTunes charts. People are talking about it. People are listening, emailing me, commenting. It's great. It's great. Feels like we're really onto something here. And I thank you for being a part of it. First up on the podcast today, tell me this hasn't happened to you. Okay, you're standing there and you're shaking hands and you're saying goodbye to somebody and you're going to walk away, and then you both realize you're walking together in the same direction because your cars are parked in the same parking lot. Or this, you burst into a meeting room only to find that it's not your meeting. Or you're in one of those conversations, those conversations where it's more silence than dialogue. It's just awkward and there's nothing going on. Well, those are all awkward situations and they are a part of life. And if you're the one who made the mistake, you might feel like crawling into a hole. But it's important to note that typically it's not the awkward moment that's the problem. It's how you interpret it. Joshua Clegg is an associate professor of psychology at John Jay College, City University of New York. And he's researched this whole phenomenon of awkward moments. And he has some advice for dealing with those awkward moments. Know that they're normal, first of all, and don't assume you've ruined everything because you probably haven't. Everyone's done this. You're not an idiot. Everything is going to be fine. He also suggests that you call it out, that you say, oh, this is awkward. Uh-oh, awkward. Acknowledge awkward moments for what they are, and it often just lightens things up. Don't run away. Diffuse the situation now, because if you don't, it will always be awkward whenever you see that person or those people again for all of eternity. And get out of your own head, because when someone says you have spinach in your teeth, it bothers you a lot more than it bothers them. They're not particularly offended by the spinach in your teeth. They're just wanting you to know that you've got spinach in your teeth. You're just a little freaked out because it's now the topic of conversation, but it will pass and no one will remember. And that's something you should know. So every time you go by a gas station, you see the sign with the prices, and the price for gas always ends in 0.9 cents. And you've probably thought to yourself, do they really think I'm that stupid that I don't see what they're doing here? Clearly, they want us to see the price as a penny less, or specifically 0.9 cents less than it really is, that we see the big number and we think that's the price. And the fact is, we all do fall for that to some extent. Not because we're dumb necessarily, but it's because how our brain processes money and financial information differently. It's really quite fascinating, and it's more than a little odd. And someone who's really explored this is Claudia Hammond. She's a broadcaster for BBC Radio in London and author of the book Mind Over Money. So Claudia, what is it about money and finances that makes us think and do such odd things?
I think money is difficult because when you've got money, it gives you lots of opportunities, and that's great. But I think that money is something that we find endlessly perplexing, and I think that we tend to all think that we're good at spotting, say, what's good value and what isn't, just as most of us think we're above average car drivers, and yet we can't all be above average drivers because somebody's got to be average and somebody's got to be below average. But likewise, we think we're really good at spotting deals, and it turns out that we're not very good at spotting deals. And so all sorts of other things can influence the decisions that we make about money and about price. So in one experiment, they gave people a menu for a restaurant called Studio 19 and asked people how much they'd be prepared to pay for a meal there. And then they gave exactly the same menu to another group of people and told them it was called Studio 97. And suddenly people were prepared to pay much more to eat at the restaurant with the higher number in its name, which isn't a rational thing, but something that we all do. So I think we're almost aware that we don't always behave rationally with it, and that makes us all the more obsessed with it.
Well, that's really stupid to think that you would spend more money at Studio 97 just because it's 97.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, but it's a thing called anchoring, and it's a psychological process that's been really well demonstrated that irrelevant numbers can make a difference to us, and that we will make predictions based on those, which just does seem like the weirdest thing. But for example, in a study looking at car auctions, if a really expensive car had just been sold, then even if the next car was a cheap type of car, it would go for more money. So if you had a Rolls Royce and then the next car was a Mini, the Mini would go for more money just because there was a Rolls Royce before it, which again shows just how irrational, but often in predictable ways, we can be.
Well, but we're also fighting the people who know this stuff and use it against us, right?
Yes, that's absolutely true. So there are plenty of strategies that shops will use to try to get us to part with our money. You know, they want us to spend their money. And so one of the things you often see is that items in shops and online are often laid out in threes. And there'll often be a cheap one, one that's a little bit more expensive, and then sometimes a really expensive one. If you think of something like laptops, you get a cheap one, then next to it a kind of mid-price one, and then a really sleek and shiny, beautiful one. And the only reason that expensive one is there is to try to persuade you to go for the middle one instead, because that seems a good compromise. So in experiments, if you only have the cheaper two, half the people will choose the very cheapest and half will choose the other one. But the moment you put in a third really expensive item, suddenly that sways people's opinions, and twice as many will go for what is now the middle item when they were never intending to spend that much money. And so we do need to be really careful when we're shopping and to watch for the strategies that might be being used, and whether there are other things around that are influencing us on whether we think something is good value or not.
Yeah, I remember hearing that restaurants do this with the second most expensive wine.
Yes, yeah. They often people choose the second most expensive wine because they don't want to look as if they're choosing the cheap one. They don't want something really expensive. You know, lots of us don't know very much about wine and don't necessarily want to spend more on it. And so people don't want to look mean. So they often choose the second one thinking, oh, well, that must be good. And actually, because restaurants know this, the second price one isn't very good value because so many people will go for it. And in fact, if a place is any good, then in their house wine, they should be choosing something that's perfectly nice. And so now I often go for the very cheapest wine of all now, just assuming, well, it's probably going to be fine. And 9 times out of 10 it is. Yeah,
right. So what are some of these other things that people need to be aware of that we happen automatically and unconsciously, and yet we fall for it pretty much every time?
Yeah, there's all sorts of things where we get things slightly wrong. I mean, one is called the Endowment Effect, which is where we overvalue things that we already own. We like things that we already have. So people would rather, trade in their car for more money and then spend more money on the car they're replacing it with than trade theirs in for less and save money on the new car. And there's no good reason for doing that. But we really like things that we already own. And so this means that when people are trying to sell things online, for example, people will often put a reserve on, and they'll often overvalue the thing they're trying to sell, because we assume that because we have it and we liked it and we wanted it and we already have it, it must be worth more, and that other people will also think that, when of course people won't necessarily think that. Another mistake we make is to, when it comes to saving, we tend to think that, all of us tend to think that in the future we'll earn more, we'll save more, and we'll be better at spending less. And, gradually, if people get promoted, they might earn more in the future, but, who knows what will happen with different industries in the future. But when it comes to saving more and spending less, that's probably not going to happen at all unless we change. So just as we all tend to think that we'll have more spare time in the future and we'll be more organized versions of ourselves in the future, that won't happen either unless we change something about ourselves and the way we behave and make a very conscious decision to do that. And so that means that people tend to save less now because they think, oh, we're going to do it later on. It'll all be fine. I'll do that later on. And the chances are we won't. We don't really change our habits very easily unless we make a really conscious effort to do so.
Is that just optimism? We think things will be fine, so we just go on our merry way.
Yeah, one of the strongest cognitive biases, as we call them, is the optimism bias, that we just hope that things will be fine and think things will be fine. We often also think that the future is quite far away, and just the way you phrase it can make a difference to that. So if someone's going to retire in 10 years' time, that feels like quite a long way off, time to save up and sort things out. But if you think of it as 3,652-ish days instead, that sounds, it's a bigger number, it sounds quite close, 3,000 days, sounds quite soon. And that research has shown that if you frame things in a different way like that, if you just change the wording, it can make the future seem nearer, and then you'll start to plan and save up more instead.
So we're entering the holiday season, and so what about traps that we fall into when we're buying gifts and things, which is, this time of year when we buy probably more gifts than any other time of year?
Yes, I think when it comes to buying gifts, particularly at the last moment, people can, find themselves panicking and not necessarily buying the thing that a person will really like and actually want and value, and that maybe, buying things like experiences can make a difference, and more of a difference to people's well-being. So treating somebody to a nice day away somewhere could be more effective, if you like, in making them feel happier, which is what we all want, than buying them an item, buying them material goods. And there's really good evidence that that's the case. The good thing about buying gifts is that also, if you look at the evidence on well-being, it does show that spending money on other people is a good thing, and that giving gifts to other people does make us feel happier. That in one experiment, they gave people at 9 a.m, they stopped people in the street and they gave them an envelope with $20 in it. And they said to them, you've got until 5 p.m. to spend this. And half of them were told they must spend it on themselves. And half of them were told they must spend it on someone else or give it to charity. And they measured people's mood. And at the end of the day, at 5 p.m, they had to meet up again. And they measured their mood again. And the people who had spent it on someone else actually felt happier and had a better day than the people who spent it on themselves. So the good thing about the gift season is that buying things for people and giving nice things to other people does make us happier. But I think it's easy to panic and to think that you need to buy the thing that looks expensive rather than the thing that's more thoughtful, that they might really, really want, which is what they'll really care about.
One of the things parallel to that I've heard recently is that we should spend more money on experiences than things because we get more satisfaction from that. And then I've heard that, well, maybe that's not always true. I guess it depends on the experience and what the thing would have been.
Yeah, it depends on whether it goes well, obviously. A bad experience is not going to be a good thing. And it does depend on the thing, because sometimes the thing can lead to more experiences. So if you didn't have a car but then get a car, then that could enable you to connect with other people more and to visit people that you've not had a chance to, or to go out to the countryside and have a nice time. That could lead to experiences, so that might be a good thing to buy. But yeah, and it's absolutely true that the evidence does show that experiences improve our well-being more than owning things. And one of the reasons is that with an experience, we anticipate it more. We spend more time thinking about what it will be like. You think about what a weekend will be like more than you might think about what it would be like to have a bigger TV. You might want a bigger TV, but you're not going to think about the experience and imagine it in the same way. And also, experiences often connect you with other people, so you might be away or out for the day with them. And then when you get back, you've got warm memories to look back on. So even though it seems like, all the money's gone in one go, whereas the thing you could be still enjoying, on the whole, the experiences are giving people more pleasure. And what's really interesting is that the group they're calling millennials now, the younger people, are now spending more money on experiences than on things, which the evidence suggests that they're doing the right thing.
Well, so far we've talked about how we're all basically manipulated in how we think about money, but I'm wondering too, and I'm going to ask you in a moment, about ways we can use this thought process to our advantage. But first, I want to talk about our sponsor today, Audible.com. If you haven't tried audiobooks, you've got to try it. If you like podcasts, you'll love audiobooks. And Audible.com has a special offer that you can get a free audiobook download and 30-day free trial to their service just to check it out and see what you think. And you can pick any one of their books. They've got zillions of books. And one of them is Claudia's book, Mind Over Money, which she narrates in that lovely British accent. You can get that book or really any book they have and a free 30-day trial to their service. You just go to audibletrial.com/SYSK, audibletrial.com/SYSK, which stands for something you should know, and that lets them know how you found out about them. So get your free audiobook download and 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/SYSK. So we've talked about how we're all kind of deluded and mystified and manipulated by some of these thought processes and how we think about money. But how do we use this to our advantage?
Yeah, definitely. So I think to try and save more money, one of the things you can do is to try to reframe the way you think about the future. And also it's been shown that sometimes financial advisors will say to people, you should just start afresh, start again with a clean sheet, and from now on you'll save lots of money. But research has shown that actually it's more real. People make more realistic plans that they're more likely to stick to if they do look back to work out at the past, to work out why didn't it work the last time they tried to save up? What were the unexpected expenses that crop up, that always do, and could they take that into account somehow and come up with a more a more realistic way of saving? There's been a really clever experiment in the US that the psychologist Richard Thaler did, which was called Save Money Tomorrow, where people committed that when their salary went up in the future, they would save a little bit more money. And we don't mind promising future money. We don't like promising money now, but we love the idea of pay rise in the future. So we think in the future we won't care if we save a bit more because we'll have that extra money, so it'll be fine. It won't feel like a penalty now. And so they got people to commit to saving in the future, and it was really successful, and people were able to save much more. Another thing people can do is that if people's money is in an account with a name that sounds geographically far away from where you live, then people are less likely to dip into that money, because even though you can just get that money online, it feels as if it's further away. So anything that makes the money feel less accessible and more of a bother to get means people are likely to leave it there for longer. So in a way, you can trick yourself.
So just naming the account my Yugoslavian account makes it harder to get?
You could call it that, or choosing a bank that's got the name. Choosing a bank that's that's got the name of a state that's miles from where you live will make it seem as if it's further away, because we tend to still have this idea that in our minds we slightly imagine that that our money is actually there in the bank, and that our little pile of money is somewhere, and that it's not all just mixed up in a load of figures on a screen like we know in reality it's like that. But we imagine that our little bit is there, and so if you can imagine it's further away, you're less likely to dip into it. It
is so weird how we process this kind of information when, if you really sat down and stopped to think about it, it's nonsense. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. It is, and there are always little cues and little things that we don't actually notice consciously that are affecting the decisions that we make all the time. And we go around looking for information that confirms what we already think. We notice that information more, and that can make a real difference to what we end up saving, what we end up spending, and the sorts of judgments we make about money.
Well, just the idea of name brands has always fascinated me, that people will spend more for a name brand, sometimes lots more, when, the generic brand is exactly the same thing.
Yeah, it is really interesting, and there's been some actually really interesting experiments with wine and with painkillers. And so with wine, they put people in a brain scanner and they fed them some wine through a straw. Probably not the best way of drinking wine, but they fed them it through a straw. And then sometimes they told them it was a $90 bottle of wine, and other times they told them it cost only $5. And people not only said that they liked the wine that they thought was expensive better, but their brains actually liked it better as well. So there was more activity in the reward centers of the brains when they thought the wine was expensive. So they actually were enjoying it more if they thought it was expensive. So, the lesson from that maybe is to encourage your friends to bring cheap wine round, but to tell you it's expensive wine. And then with painkillers, there was a fascinating study where we know that the generic and the branded versions are very open about, they say the ingredients, and they are the same ingredients. So you might have the same amount of ibuprofen or paracetamol that's in a tablet. It's exactly the same thing, but one is a brand and will have lovely fancy box. Now, what's really extraordinary here is that actually, if people thought that they had the branded medicine, it did give them more effective pain relief. They gave them tests of their pain thresholds, and they had to put their arm in a bucket of ice water, and they could actually keep it there longer if they had the branded drug and thought they had the branded drug. And so there, the placebo effect was being harnessed, and the fact that they thought it was more expensive made a difference. So weirdly, with that one, if your headache is really, really bad, maybe you should buy the more expensive one, because then it will be really effective. Or you need to get somebody else to give it to you and tell you it's the expensive one.
One of the things, and I think maybe this applies more to women than men, but that handbags, for example, or certain things that have status because they are such and such a brand, that people will pay, and men do it too, I guess, with suits and things that just seem so ridiculous.
Yeah, we do pay a lot of attention to the status that a brand can give us, and I think that seems to be increasing more and more. And if you look at the amounts now being spent on, more money than ever before is being spent on luxury brands that are really, really, really expensive. And I think it does apply to men as well, and it may be sometimes different things, but people will like the brand of a certain brand of car more than another, or a certain brand of watch, or anything that they think increases their status. But if you look at the research on materialism, if people want to buy something expensive in order to generate envy in other people and in order to get power, then actually it's not going to work, and it's not going to make them feel any better or any better about themselves. If people want to buy the really expensive branded thing because they genuinely like it and think that thing is really nice and will get pleasure from using that thing, then it can increase their well-being a bit. But it all depends on what it is you're reading into those brands.
Right. So if you buy, a $20,000 watch, are people actually impressed by that? Are other people thinking, wow, look at that? I don't know that I would know a $20,000 watch if I saw one. But
exactly. See, I wouldn't know what's a fake and what. Personally, I wouldn't know which is a fake and which isn't. So it would just look like a kind of, big flashy watch to me. But it could still be a cheap flashy watch. So I think if somebody actually knows well enough to be able to spot which is a real one, then maybe somebody might be impressed that, this means they must have lots of money. They must be very successful, but they're probably more likely to just know that from other things about them. They might know what their job is, or they might know what their successes are. So I don't think I don't think it's an effective way of trying to fool people into thinking you're successful.
One of the things that people say is one of the dumbest things people do with money is buy lottery tickets. But then again, somebody does eventually win. So, it could be me. It could be just as well could be me as the guy that won.
Exactly, and it's absolutely true that, the chances of winning, we all know, are really, 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 really small. And I think that people, to say it's irrational is in a way forgetting that people like the fun of that, and they like the permission to imagine that they might win, and the moment when the numbers come up and they're looking at the numbers and gives them a little while to, imagine, fantasize about what that would be like and what they would do with the money and, improve their well-being temporarily at that moment. I think the problem is if people then feel they have to carry on and on doing it. So I think if you are going to buy lottery tickets, what you shouldn't do is buy the same number every week, because if you always buy the same number, you've got to carry on doing it, because otherwise you'll have the regret. If you found out one week that you hadn't done it and that it had won, you would know that because of the number, and you'd have a massive regret about that. And we really, really hate regret. There's a very strong psychological aversion to regret. And so if you always do something different, then it means you don't have to do it every week, and you don't have to worry about that. I mean, some places have got around this. In Holland, there's a fiendishly clever lottery that automatically puts everyone's postcode, their zip code, into the lottery. And so you can either buy a ticket, in which case you could win with your postcode, but if you don't buy a ticket, you couldn't, but you're always going to know which it is. And also, all your neighbours might win and you might not. So it's a very clever way of getting people to buy tickets.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was the California lottery here that had a marketing campaign that I thought was very effective that said, what would happen if your numbers won without you?
But that's a genius campaign, because there's very strong evidence that we really hate the regret of what might have happened, and that is something that's prompting people into buying tickets for lotteries.
I would never check. If I forgot to play my numbers that week, I would never go look and see, because what if...
Never look, never check. Never check.
I wonder if that's ever happened. I've never heard of that happening, but I wonder if anyone ever did always play and missed once and their numbers won.
Oh, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are stories like that. Just as you get the stories of the people who, put it in the washing machine and then they try to find it and they try and piece the pieces back together and know that their numbers came up but that they've missed out.
Yeah. Anything else? You've covered so much, but any other little things that you find when you did the research for this that was really fascinating that people may not realize?
One thing I think is really interesting is that paying friends for favors is not a good idea. And it seems like a nice idea because they're doing a favor for you and then you're giving them some money, which sounds kind. But actually, it's a mistake, because the moment you do that, it reframes their nice piece of altruism as a financial transaction. And so then the other person will start looking and thinking, well, was this a good amount? I'm helping them change their tire and they're offering me $20, but actually they'd have to pay a mechanic much more than that, and maybe it'll take me quite a long time because it's quite a tricky one, and I could earn more maybe doing something else, and have they given me the right amount? Whereas if you just thank them for doing the lovely thing and then maybe buy them a present later, not money but a present, some flowers or some chocolate or something they might like later on, then everything will work much better, and it doesn't bring money into the friendship. It just allows people to be kind to each other, which is a nicer thing. So I think that's a quite good tip that's come out of some U.S. research that's really interesting. That
is interesting, but it's so right on when I think about that. I mean, when you say I'll give you $20 to change my tire, you're putting a value on that maybe is unfair, and it's better not to put a value on it at all.
Yeah, so weirdly, it's another case where it might seem irrational because you think surely getting $20 is better than getting no money. No, in fact, they'll leave feeling better if they got no money.
Well, terrific. I appreciate your time, and that's really interesting stuff. And you're a good interview because you're a professional and know how to do interviews.
Okay. Well, good questions too. So thank you very much for having me.
Claudia Hammond from the BBC in London and author of the book Mind Over Money. There's a link to her book on Amazon.com. On our website, on the show notes page for this episode, which is located at somethingyoushouldknow.net. And finally today, on Something You Should Know, appreciation. We tend to show our appreciation for other people more this time of year than other times of year. And while giving gifts and throwing parties is great, appreciation is something that works all year round, both in relationships and at work. Consider the fact that appreciation is one of the top reasons people leave relationships and friendships, and it is the number one reason people quit their job. So giving appreciation is really, it's kind of the glue that holds relationships and organizations together. In a work environment that fosters a culture of appreciation, the payoffs are big. According to consultant Paul White, when employees feel appreciated at work, people show up, they show up on time, there's less turnover, there's an increase in customer satisfaction, there's less conflict, there's more positive work environment, and there's just a zillion benefits to doing it. If you have any doubt about the power of appreciation, go home tonight and start appreciating everything about your partner and watch what happens. That's the podcast today. I appreciate you listening. And if you'd like more information, you can go to our website, somethingyoushouldknow.net, and find the show notes page for this episode. And if you have a moment, I would more than appreciate if you could leave a rating and review of this podcast on iTunes. I'm Mike Carruthers. Thanks for listening today to Something You Should Know.